Chapter 10. A Ship of Souls. Nay, in thy own mean perplexities, do thou thyself but hold thy tongue for one day. Sartor Rosatus, Chapter 3. My operation produced a subtle change in my attitude towards this grim hostelry of pain. It seemed no longer quite so forbidding. I was not alien, I was initiate, sealed to the order by suffering. It was not that I liked it better, but that I had begun, curiously, to feel myself a part of it, constrained to share its fortunes, whatever they might be. One night, I recall vividly awakening in the warm darkness, looking at the dim light on the narrow wall, listening to the wind that crept and cooled and whistled at my window, for it was now the dead of winter. I had suddenly the feeling that I was in the cabin of some great ship. It was like a great ship, and I outward bound with 1,000 other souls for some far port. Were we safe? Were we safe? Outside, I could hear feet pacing the muffled deck, and from time to time the signal that called the captain to some part of the great ship. The orderlies, they would be the stewards, and the nurses, the stewardesses. And there were the robust young officers who came to reassure the suffering or fearful passengers. There on the stand by my side stood the veritable flowers my friends had brought, a bon voyage for my journey. It was an idea that grew upon my imagination. After I had recovered sufficiently to be wrapped up in warm blankets, it was down the gangway they trundled me, and I was placed in a steamer chair on the lee deck. Even the incongruity of snow on the ground, the roar in the streets, the sun gleaming palely through the murk of the city, and a sparrow perched on the rail, did not shake my feeling that it was a ship I was travelling in. There is loneliness on a long voyage, even to one who has learned in some measure to live in the house of his own spirit, and one turns with eagerness to his fellow passengers. Strange men and women whom he has never seen before, nor heard of, and yet they are somehow bound to him, and he to them, by the common experiences and dangers of the voyage. Who are they, then? What is their port? It is like that greater and sometimes painful voyage on the good ship Earth, where, whether we like it or not, we are fellow passengers with many a strange human being. It is singular, in a ship, how much one can come to know of his fellow voyagers by mere propinquity, by chance meeting on the deck, by random talk in the saloons. When one hears a man groaning piteously in an adjoining cabin, how can he avoid coming presently to know something about him? Without ever having seen him, I came to know quite well a fine young officer who had had 3 amputations of his leg and was tossing in a wild delirium of fever. How I watched for news of his progress as it came daily by way of the attendants, and what relief when at length he won the doubtful struggle. I had been easily comfortable, I thought, compared with him. "When you go out," I said one day to my nurse, "set the screen a little aside so that I can look through the door." With my head properly bolstered up, I watched the people going by in the broad corridor, and it made me think of the road in my own town, and all the curious people that ride or drive or walk in it. And many of them, I thought, I should like well if I could come to know them better. One in particular I watched for every day, a blind man, walking quickly, chin up, a woman, I thought a nurse, guiding him, with her arm locked firmly through his. Blind he was, and yet there was something confident and courageous about him. Possibly, I thought, he is going on to the eye clinic. He is bracing himself for an operation. "Who is the blind man who goes by every day?" I asked finally. "Why, that," replied my nurse, "is Dr. Lyne. And that is not a nurse, but his wife who guides him." "A doctor?" "Yes, Dr. Lyne." Something, a very little, I uncurled of his story, the courage of it, the toil of it, the devotion of it, and indeed the success of it. He might well have excused himself in facing life. Doth God exact day labour, light denied? But he had gone onward, centering all the powers that remained to him in the touch of his strong and delicate fingers. He had found a calling fitted to his gifts. He was a kind of sculptor in living tissues, nerves, bones, a story one liked to enlarge upon, to tell himself. As I began to creep out in my long gown, like some preposterously old man, I could look in as I passed at many a half-screened doorway. If one could but capture it, I thought, there was a story in every room. Not petty stories either, dealing with inconsequential things, but going down deep where life turns upon the stark realities of pain and sorrow and death. I came during the days of my slow recovery to know a little of some of them. One of the voyagers was a mere lad, suffering the aftermath of infantile paralysis, lying with his legs painfully strapped and weighted. He had been on a long, long voyage, and upon reaching port he would probably have to limp ashore. And yet a cheerier lad I never saw, the slow southern humour in the turn of his voice, the glint in his eye. I liked to have him wheeled into my room for a visit, he in his chair and I in my bed. No lugubrious conversation did we indulge in, never a word of commiseration, but gusts of laughter, that there should be so many ridiculous and humorous things in a hospital. One passenger I came to know had been long on his voyage, a seasoned traveller compared with me. He had many books on his cabinet, symbols of his permanence, and framed pictures near him on his stand, one of a splendid boy who was, I learned, his son. He read me a poem he had written, in the nights when I find it hard to sleep, and it was for this son he wrote it. The refrain alone I recall because it contained, bound up in a few words, what he himself had learned during his hard voyage. This was it. "Plough on, my son, plough on." Another man I chanced to meet during these days of my own slow recovery had an indescribable fascination for me. He was going to die and did not know it. Everyone about seemed aware of it. It was the bandied news of the corridor, a significant look of the eye, a nod of the head as one went by his door. There in that room is a man who is going to die. It gave me the strangest sense of tense awareness. I had, in the past, seen men die. I had known the sorrow of the death of dear friends. But death, it is curious when I think of it, had never for me, previous to my experience in the hospital, seemed at all a reality. It was something terrible that happened to other people, and though it may appear shocking in the telling, but it is so, I thought of it somehow as their own fault. Here it had come close to me in many forms as a stark reality, something that might even happen to me. In this place it was no longer a phenomenon, but a measurable and daily expectancy. It was this new congeries of observation and intense feeling that so stirred my interest in this man who was going to die and did not know it. One day I met him. He had read something I had once written and asked if I would come to see him. I went with the greatest hesitation and reluctance, and yet with an overpowering curiosity. How must the man feel who was about to die? What would he think? How would he look? What would he say? As I walked down the corridor with the nurse who brought the message, these questions came upon me with a vividness and power I cannot describe. In my imagination, I saw the poor fellow in bed, emaciated, slow of breath, feebly reaching out his hand to touch mine. I could scarcely control the beating of my heart or the trembling of my knees when I stepped around the screen. "How are you, sir?" said a steady voice. "Come in, I'm glad to see you." There he sat in his chair, a stout, rather florid man in a gay-coloured dressing gown. There were flowers on his table, a world of flowers, and pictures of a smiling, grey-haired woman and a smiling girl and two little boys. In front of him, on a desk, piles of neatly arranged papers, as though he had just looked up from his daily affairs. It was I who was hesitant and embarrassed, for I could not quickly adjust reality and preconception. It was he who made everything easy and hospitable. While I sat talking with him, a nurse brought in a telegram, which he slit open in the quick, nervous, incidental manner of the businessman. He glanced at it and tossed it on the desk, proceeding with his conversation. It came over me with a kind of shock. What futile urgency, if the man was going to die? Then I remembered, with a wave of pity, that he did not know. It was not long before I could place him. He was quite a typical American businessman, self-confident, positive, vital. He did not tell me in so many words that he was rich. He radiated it. He told me of a deal he had just cleared up, in which he had made a killing. I found that his secretary came in every morning to take care of a lot of little matters. I kept forgetting, but it would come over me suddenly and with a sinking sense of futility. Why all these deals? What good making any more money? The man is going to die. The next day, when I stopped to see him, I found the nurse reading a newspaper aloud, and when he began to talk of the depression in business and the outlook for certain stocks, I kept saying to myself, now, what is the use of all that? He talked again quite volubly about himself and his affairs, but presently he broke off and I saw him looking at me with a slow, inscrutable gaze. "Are you here for long?" he asked. As I paused, I thought his look intensified, and there was something deep down and far back in his narrowing eyes, or did I imagine it, that was pitiful to see. "The doctors," said I, "are promising me that I can go home for Christmas." I shall never forget the pause that followed. My glance drifted away to the picture of the smiling, grey-haired woman on his table, nor the peculiar tone of his voice, deep, still, one word. Christmas. They had all said he did not know, but I knew as well as though he had told me in so many words. He knew. No doubt he had known all along. My whole heart went out to him so I could scarcely keep the tears from my eyes. I looked at him again. Yes, there was a kind of mediocrity about the man. He had few intellectual resources, but what a fighter! What a fighter! He was playing the game straight through to the end. It seemed to me at the moment as though, of all things in the world, such courage, such steadiness was most to be admired. He had not thought out a philosophy. He had it. He could walk up to death with it. Telegrams? Yes. Why not? Deals? Yes. Why not? A secretary every morning to take his letters? Why not? They were not futilities. They were of the essence of the matter. He was refusing to be beaten by the past or crushed by the future. He was living as a man ought to live, every fibre of him, in the only moment he ever really possesses, this moment. It came to me with intolerable clarity. Why? We're all going to die and don't know it, and this is what we should do about it. I cannot tell what the man's religious beliefs were, if he had any. Once or twice during the few days I knew him, he seemed on the point of saying something to me. I knew. But the moment passed. How I should have liked to know. But of this I am certain. He had faith. Faith of some kind. Men differ in that. I have mine and you yours. In its essence, it is a deep, deep sense of confidence, of calmness, that whatever happens, whatever the process, it is natural, it is universal, it is according to law. I saw, borne down the long corridor, a still, white-covered figure quite cured of the fever of living. To die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier.